The 2021 Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to a pair of journalists dedicated to promoting freedom of expression in their countries. Russian Dmitry Meritov and Marissa Ressa of the Philippines received the honor Friday morning. The prizes come as more journalists from around the world are facing hostility and threats. That's according to the nonprofit organization Committee to Protect Journalists. Disinformation about COVID-19 is fueling attacks on the press. For more on this, I want to bring in Robert Mahoney. He's the Deputy Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thanks for being here, Robert. So some journalists say that they are even unsure about the future of their career because of the growing threats against them. Can you share with our viewers some examples of the violence that journalists are encountering in the field?
Yes, thanks for inviting me on. I wanted to talk about the physical assaults that we've seen on journalists. I mean, in the United States, just this year, my organization, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has documented attacks on 7 journalists covering largely protests around COVID, against vaccine mandates, against vaccines. And they've been spat on, pushed, shoved, their equipment taken from them. And we've seen the same thing happening in Europe, too, where journalists now are afraid sometimes to go out to cover these kinds of these protests. In the past, it used to be that journalists feared the police more than private individuals, but now it's private individuals that are doing a lot of the attacks.
We had seen attacks in the United States increase against journalists who were covering politics. It's interesting now that this has spread into COVID and these protests that we're seeing about mask mandates and vaccine mandates. As you mentioned, this is happening across the globe, including in Europe. But how common are these attacks in the United States, and how different is this from where the United States used to be?
Well, they're becoming increasingly common. I wouldn't say that they're totally widespread. We've seen them in LA, we've seen them in Portland, Oregon. And as I said, we've had 7 such attacks this year, none last year. They're tending to come from some of these fringe groups, some associated with QAnon conspiracies that blame the media for spreading false narratives, in air quotes, about vaccines or about COVID itself. And so I would say that these are fringe elements, but nevertheless, they have the effect of maybe making journalists think twice about covering some of these protests.
And many of these attacks involve people who reject the science behind COVID-19 research. Why are people increasingly unwilling to accept factual reporting?
I think that some of this is to do with the poisonous effects of social media that really does spread bad information and outright lies very, very fast. And it's incredibly difficult to catch up behind a lie that's running around the world with facts. And some people are locked in their own echo chambers and only get the news fed to them through their social media feeds that they want to see, or some algorithm believes that they want to see. So journalists are fighting an uphill battle against propaganda and false information. And the COVID pandemic has just, exacerbated this situation where there is just so much bad information out there, and people really do believe it, even if it's against all facts.
What are the long-term implications if this continues?
Well, the long-term implications are that it's going to become more dangerous for reporters to go out into the field to report. We've already seen this when you're covering conflict, where journalists have become targets. But we think of that happening overseas, in the Middle East or in Africa, where journalists have been kidnapped. Now we see a worsening of the situation in Western Europe and in North America by these fringe groups. And the implications of that is that we will not get necessarily the kinds of coverage that would be objective, that we would normally expect to get, because journalists might be intimidated into not covering, particularly those journalists such as freelancers who don't have the security apparatus of a big news company behind them to protect them. I was talking to one Austrian journalist, a freelancer, who now asks for volunteers to go out with him to protect him when he's covering anti-vax protests.
Volunteer bodyguards. It does not sound like a sustainable model. Robert, since you find so much of the roots of this anger and hostility and misinformation is coming from social media, and that is not expected to go away at any point soon, what can change in order to stop this disturbing trend, not just to protect journalists, but also for the essential role that they play in society and in democracies?
Well, one of the things that is exacerbating the situation is a lack of local news. We've watched news deserts grow up all over the United States where local news outlets have closed down because they've lost their advertising revenue. So one of the ways to counter some of this propaganda is to have journalists who live in the community, who know the people that they're covering, and are able to build some trust. But that's a long-term trend which has caused local newspapers to dry up. That's one thing. And the other thing is for the tech companies to continue and do a better job of cleaning up their act and making sure that we're not getting this fire hose of misinformation every time we open our phones or laptops.
Robert Mahoney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa has spent her career combating disinformation online. In our CBSN original Fake News, Real Consequences, she discusses how it can be used as a tool to silence critics and blur the line between fact and fiction. You can watch the full documentary right now at cbsnews.com/fake news.